All right, so now I am at 8.5, surviving. The lot that fell to nurses turned out to be just as bad, if not worse in many ways, than what had happened to a lot of the men in the field. Because some men in Vietnam never got into the field. Remember, there were, in fact, most of them didn't, because the soldier who is at, they call it, at the tip of the spear or at the sharp end or the sharp edge, there are these 10 support people who are doing supply and maintenance and logistics and the hundreds of thousands of things that bureaucracy needs to run, right? So that's where a lot of the things is happening. But the nurses, however, whether under fire or not, saw a year's worth of dying men, mostly aged 19 to 20. And so it was an onslaught. And for many years after the nurses came back from Vietnam, the people who are working in large emergency ERs in hospitals in big cities, New York and Chicago and Boston, Baltimore, places where there were these bad race riots and lots of gunshot wounds and so on. The doctors running ER surgeries, because these are emergency room surgeries, which are like, that's it, we got to operate now, and there'd be a team on, hired combat nurses because they could keep up with it. And they were like, yeah, okay, that's nothing. Like they'd have maybe one or two shootings a night. Ugh, that was nothing. I mean, they were used to having, 5 or 6 shootings a day, or they would have what Van de Meter talks about as mass cal, a mass casualty. The nurses, about this, Van de Meter says, Vietnam was the worst time of my life, yet it was also in many ways the most important and most intense. For years I tried to talk about it. Nobody listened, on page 13. So recovering this Vietnam year, the war year, really could only start, most vets learned, by talking. You had to find other people who had been in the situation, and you had to talk to them. And it wasn't so much that you talked to them to get advice as you talked to them to be heard, and so people would listen to your story. This psychiatric movement began to roll, and the Johnson actually began to put a lot of money into, because they could see they were going to be overwhelmed with psychiatric casualties. Men at this point coming back from the war, there were women too, but they just weren't talking about it because they were like, it wasn't a thing. I mean, women were supposed to come home and just suck it up. So the women nurses were in some ways in much worse condition because they weren't helped. But what LBJ did was he began this idea of storefront treatment, basically that there would be a storefront clinic in every town, in every small town. Because in the big cities, it's one thing. But in small towns, which is where a lot of the men came from, there would be no medical treatment. So the idea was that you would have what these two psychiatrists, Robert J. Lifton and Khayyam Shatan, started off with, which was basically rap groups, which was sort of using some stuff from the human potential movement in the West in California and importing it and using that, which was going to become it would become mashed up with Alcoholics Anonymous and then all the different anonymous, various different Gamblers Anonymous and so on, which would be begun at this point. And they began to sort of learn from each other. It's like, if we get groups together and you can get to a meeting anytime, this may be the best way to get through this stuff without necessarily having a doctor around who can help you out and who knows exactly what's going on. Because the likelihood is the doctors don't necessarily know what's going on, but your fellow veterans may know more. So these vets made counseling into something that it turned out more people needed than didn't. And if we've had one thing to see in Vietnam, it's that the veterans forced discussions about mental health the way it had never been seen before in the history of the world. I mean, we have never seen anything like this. And we are all benefiting from this. The reason that there are mental health resources at the University of Western Ontario available, even if they're oversubscribed, there are some. is because this is basically the outcome of Vietnam, that people came back from Vietnam and they needed help. And the kind of help they needed wasn't available in the quantities they needed it, and it was too expensive. So the psychiatric movement was, can people help themselves? Can there be self-help groups? Yes, was the answer to that. It's like, okay, well, that turned out to really function. Well, if it really functions, it's like, why can't we go on doing that? Well, we have gone on doing that. So this concept is something which basically people accept getting therapy for anxiety problems, depression problems. Are a lot of us are getting help because of the Vietnam War. Van Deventer certainly suffered terribly from what we would now call PTSD, that is post-traumatic stress disorder, and probably a number of you have heard about this, know about it. And the issue with PTSD is that it's now kind of used to describe everything. And it appears as though people sort of believe that any trauma is going to, sort of blow the fuses in their brains. It's like, well, there's a lot of sort of standard life stuff that we also have to learn to handle. That one of the sort of parts of being I don't want to say an adult, but if somebody who's grown older, I always say about myself, if I haven't grown up, I've certainly grown older. And then as you grow older, you learn it's like, oh, okay, this kind of crap's going to happen, and you have to deal with it. You got to figure out a way to deal with that, and you are going to deal with it. You're going to be okay. It just may suck right at that point. But then there's PTSD, the kind of PTSD that keeps you from sleeping, that makes you unable to get out of bed for months or years at a time, that makes you unable to maintain intimate relationships. Well, it's impossible to see how that could happen. To have you be plagued by, say, nightmares and flashbacks. And these are vivid. You wake up in a terrible sweat that will drive you to alcoholism. Or to use any narcotic, which basically will put you out of your pain and misery. That's something else. And so let me draw a line here between anxiety, which every human being is going to feel, and feelings of being down or low, which again, everybody is going to feel, and crippling amounts of anxiety where you can't eat and so on. Ultimately, in her work through the New Veterans Association, though, and what were then called rap groups didn't have anything to do with making music. It meant rapping, talking, that occurred in these storefronts. Van Deventer learned to tell other women veterans, I understand, as she says on page 12, you're not alone. Many of us have seen the same things. Together we can get past the problems. It's hard work, but it can be done. Now, let me point out two sobering things since I've given you this sort of happy ending to the book. Okay, I know it sounds like it's not a happy ending, but given the situation, it's a pretty happy ending. Van Deventer, after all, has written this book, which basically is, a real winner. It's an incredible statement of personality and so on. First, Van Deventer died at 2002 at the age of 55 of a cancer which was absolutely related to Agent Orange. Because of that same exposure, she decided that it was not possible for her to risk having children because of these teratogenic effects. Right, so remember I was talking about how Agent Orange comes into the dioxin, and the Agent Orange gets into the genes and chops up the genes, chops up the genetic material, and chops up the DNA, and can then produce these horrific birth defects. So she decides not to run that risk, and she's not the only nurse to decide that. Many nurses I know have no children because they were exposed. This is, after all, what a teratogenic weapon means. So if you were happen to be rained on or exposed to Agent Orange, you can also figure that not having children has got to be part of your life. So there you are at age 21, maybe 22, and you're not having kids. Now, in the 60s and 70s, that was a serious, serious issue for a woman whose job, after all it was, remember, was to occupy domestic space. It's still a serious issue now. Second, the suicide rate among Vietnam veterans isn't really known, although, as I say, the number of suicides, people now say the number of suicides is at 100,000. This is from Vietnam. But we just don't know. But what we can say, as I've said before, is that it has risen above 58,000. And during the middle years of America's war on Iraq, deaths by suicide in the military exceeded deaths by combat. So just keep this in mind as we think, okay, well, all's well that ends well. Van Deventer, who was a very bright, and by all accounts, I've met people who knew her well and were friends with her, that even as she was dying of cancer, that she maintained this very forward-looking and day-to-day view of life.